baby saw a bear cub being used as a street performance prop. What he did next was heroic. The rain had been falling for hours that evening, creating tiny rivers between the old cobblestones of the square. Ethan Marshall pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he walked through the nearly empty plaza, the streetlights casting long shadows that danced with each gust of wind. He wasn't supposed to be here, not really. His business meeting had ended early, and instead of heading straight back to his hotel, something had drawn him to wander through this ancient part of the city. The air smelled of wet stone and distant bread from a bakery that must have been closing for the night. His footsteps echoed softly, mixing with the gentle patter of rain, when he noticed something that made him stop completely. There, beneath the amber glow of an old-fashioned street lamp, sat an elderly man with weathered hands and tired eyes. But it wasn't the man that caught Ethan's attention. It was what sat beside him on a worn blanket. A small bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with fur that looked damp and matted from the rain. The cub wasn't performing any tricks. It wasn't dancing or standing on its hind legs like those poor creatures Ethan had seen in old circus photographs. Instead, it sat there with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural for such a young animal. Its eyes, dark and round, stared at nothing in particular, and occasionally it would shift its weight from one paw to another, as if the cold stone beneath the thin blanket was uncomfortable. A small tin cup sat in front of them, containing a few coins that clinked softly when the wind caught them just right. Ethan felt his jaw tighten. His first instinct was anger, hot and immediate. Who was this man to use a wild animal like this? The cub should be with its mother, learning to fish in streams and climb trees, not sitting on a wet street corner in a city that smelled of exhaust fumes and human desperation. He took a step forward, then another, his mind already forming the words he would say. But as he got closer, something made him pause again. The old man's face told a story that Ethan hadn't expected to see. There were deep lines around his eyes, yes, but they weren't just from age, they were the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many sunsets, from years of worry, from nights spent awake with thoughts that wouldn't let go. His clothes, though worn, were clean and carefully mended. A patch on his elbow had been sewn with precise, tiny stitches. His boots, though old, had been polished recently. This wasn't a man who had given up on dignity. The way he sat, slightly hunched but alert, suggested someone who had once stood tall but had been bent by circumstances Ethan couldn't begin to guess at. And then there were his hands. They rested on his knees. But every few moments, almost unconsciously, one would reach out and gently stroke the cub's head. It wasn't the rough, possessive touch of an owner. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like comfort, but Ethan couldn't tell if the man was comforting the cub or himself. The cub responded to these touches with the smallest movements, a slight lean into the hand, a tiny exhale that Ethan could see in the cold air. There was a connection there, something that went beyond the simple dynamic of performer and prop. Ethan found himself standing still in the rain, watching this quiet scene unfold. Other people passed by occasionally, a couple hurrying home under a shared umbrella, a businessman talking loudly on his phone, a group of teenagers laughing about something on one of their screens. Most didn't even notice the man and the cub. Those who did either dropped a coin quickly and moved on, or frowned and walked faster. Nobody stopped to really look, to really see what Ethan was beginning to see. The rain started to fall harder, and the old man reached into a bag beside him, pulling out what looked like a piece of tarp. But instead of covering himself, he carefully draped it over the cub, making sure the animal was protected from the worst of the weather. The cub didn't resist, didn't try to shake it off. It simply accepted the covering with the same resigned stillness it had shown all along. That's when Ethan noticed something else. The man's own jacket was thin, barely adequate for the dropping temperature, yet he made no move to better protect himself. All his concern seemed focused on the small creature beside him. This contradiction, this act of care in what should have been a scene of exploitation, made Ethan's anger falter and transform into something more complex, curiosity mixed with a strange kind of sadness. He moved closer still, close enough now that the man must have sensed his presence. The old man looked up, and their eyes met. Ethan expected to see guilt there, or defiance, or maybe the calculated friendliness of someone hoping for money. Instead, he saw exhaustion so deep it seemed to go all the way through to the man's soul. But there was something else, too. A flicker of what might have been hope, quickly suppressed as if the man had learned not to trust that particular emotion anymore. "Evening," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. It had an accent Ethan couldn't quite place, something that suggested mountains and distant places. The single word hung in the air between them, neither invitation nor dismissal, just an acknowledgement that they were two humans sharing the same small piece of wet pavement on a night when most people were safe and warm indoors. Ethan found himself crouching down, bringing himself to the same level as the man and the cub. Up close, he could see more details. The cub's fur, beneath the dampness, was actually well groomed. Its eyes, though sad, were clear and healthy. There were no visible signs of abuse, no scars, no marks from chains or ropes. Just that terrible stillness, that sense of something wild that had been made tame not through cruelty, but through some other means Ethan couldn't understand. "Is he yours?" Ethan asked, immediately regretting how the question sounded. Of course, the cub wasn't his in any real sense. Wild animals didn't belong to anyone, but the man seemed to understand what he was really asking. "His name is Milo," the man said softly, and there was such tenderness in the way he said it that Ethan felt something shift in his chest. "Found him 3 months ago, his mother." The man trailed off, but his hand gesture completed the sentence. "Dead." The mother was dead. Ethan had heard about this. Poachers, cars, disease. There were so many ways for wild animals to die these days, leaving behind orphans too young to survive on their own. "Couldn't just leave him there," the man continued, his voice barely audible above the rain. "Tried to find help, but the authorities said they'd have to put him down. Too young, they said. Too used to humans now. No rehabilitation center would take him without proper paperwork, and I'm not from here, I don't have the right documents." The story was starting to take shape in Ethan's mind. But it was nothing like what he had initially assumed. This wasn't exploitation. This was something far more complicated and, in its own way, far more heartbreaking. "So you kept him," Ethan said, not as an accusation but as a simple statement of fact. The man nodded, his fingers still gently stroking Milo's head. "What else could I do? I know about animals. Back home, He paused, seeming to weigh whether to continue. "I was a ranger, in the mountains. 23 years, until the park was closed. Budget cuts, they said. Development opportunities, they meant." The bitterness in his voice was old and worn smooth, like a stone that had been turned over too many times. "My name is Jacob," the man said suddenly, as if remembering that human conversations usually included such exchanges. "Jacob Bennett? And you are?" It was such a normal question in such an abnormal situation that Ethan almost laughed. Instead, he found himself saying, "Ethan Marshall." They sat there for a moment, two strangers who had exchanged names, but were still figuring out what else to exchange. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain around them that made the rest of the world seem very far away. Milo shifted slightly, and Ethan saw him yawn, a surprisingly normal, almost dog-like gesture that made the cub seem suddenly younger and more vulnerable. "He's tired," Jacob said unnecessarily. "We've been out here since noon, not many people today. Rain keeps them away." There was no complaint in his voice, just a stating of facts. Ethan looked at the tin cup with its meager collection of coins. It wouldn't be enough for a meal, let alone whatever else Jacob and Milo might need. "Where do you stay?" Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Jacob's silence confirmed it. They stayed wherever they could, under bridges probably, or in abandoned buildings. Places where no one would ask questions about a man with a bear cub. Places where they could disappear if authorities came looking. The weight of the situation settled on Ethan's shoulders like the rain soaking through his jacket. Here was a problem with no easy solution. He couldn't just give them money and walk away. That would solve nothing in the long term. He couldn't call the authorities. That would likely mean Milo's death and possibly Jacob's arrest. He couldn't take them home with him. He lived in a different country, had a life that didn't include bear cubs and homeless former rangers. But he also couldn't just walk away. Something about this scene, this quiet tragedy playing out on wet cobblestones, had hooked itself into his conscience and wouldn't let go. "Tell me about Milo," Ethan said, surprising himself with the request. "Tell me about finding him." Jacob looked at him with those tired eyes, seeming to assess whether Ethan really wanted to know or was just making conversation. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he began to speak, his voice taking on a different quality, the voice of someone who had once been used to telling stories around campfires, perhaps, or explaining the ways of the forest to curious tourists. "It was a Tuesday," Jacob began, and Ethan settled in to listen, ignoring the rain that was now soaking through his clothes. "I was walking through the woods outside the city, you know, where the old logging road meets the river. I go there sometimes. Reminds me of home. The trees are different, but trees are trees, and they don't care where you're from or what papers you have." There was a wistful quality to his voice now. "I heard crying. Not human crying, but close enough to make you stop and listen. Found him under a fallen log, so small he could fit in my 2 hands. His mother was nearby, shot. Poachers took what they wanted and left the rest." Jacob's jaw tightened at the memory. He was maybe 2 weeks old, eyes barely open, should have died within hours. The old ranger's hands moved as he spoke, recreating the size of the cub, the way he had held him. Ethan could picture it clearly, this man finding a dying infant animal and making a choice that would change both their lives. "I knew what I was supposed to do," Jacob continued. "Call it in. Let nature take its course or let the authorities handle it. But when you've spent your whole life protecting things, saving things, it's hard to stop just because you don't have a badge anymore. And when I picked him up, he stopped crying, just stopped, like he knew he was safe. How do you walk away from that?" Milo stirred at the sound of his story being told, as if he somehow understood that they were talking about him. His small black nose twitched, and he let out a soft huffing sound that might have been contentment or might have been resignation. It was hard to tell with bears, even small ones. Jacob's hand never stopped its gentle stroking motion. "First few weeks were the hardest," Jacob said. "Formula every 2 hours. Had to sell my watch to buy supplies. Learned real quick that baby bears are nothing like baby humans. They're stronger, even when they're tiny. And they have opinions about everything." A small smile crossed his face at some memory he didn't share. "But he lived," Ethan said, stating the obvious but feeling like it needed to be acknowledged. This small bear had survived against all odds, just as Jacob had kept going despite losing everything he had once been. He lived, Jacob agreed, grew stronger every day, started walking, then running, learned to eat solid food, normal bear things, except... He trailed off, and Ethan could fill in the rest. Except he was learning them from a human, in hiding, in a world that had no place for either of them. "I tried, you know," Jacob said suddenly, his voice urgent like he needed Ethan to understand this. "I tried to do the right thing, went to 3 different wildlife centers, called every number I could find, but without proper documentation, without being a citizen, without credentials they would recognize, I was nobody. Worse than nobody, I was a potential problem. One place threatened to call immigration if I didn't leave immediately." The pain in his voice was sharp, despite the obvious passage of time. "So I kept him. And he kept me, in a way. When you have something depending on you, you find ways to keep going that you didn't know existed." Ethan thought about his own life, his comfortable apartment, his stable job, his predictable routine. When was the last time something had truly depended on him? When was the last time he had made a choice that mattered beyond the next quarterly report or dinner reservation? Looking at Jacob and Milo, he felt both privileged and somehow diminished. These two had nothing, but they had each other, and that bond was more real than anything in Ethan's carefully constructed existence. "The street performance," Ethan said carefully, not wanting to sound judgmental but needing to understand. "How did that start?" Jacob's shoulders sagged slightly. "Hunger," he said simply. "His and mine. You can find food in the city if you know where to look, but not enough for a growing bear. And growing he is, faster than I expected. Soon he'll be too big for this, too big to hide, too big for me to feed." The future hung over them like a cloud darker than the ones currently dropping rain on their heads. "People see us, and they give a little money, not much, but enough to buy him meat, real food. I don't make him do tricks, I won't do that to him. We just sit, and people either help or they don't." "But it's not sustainable," Ethan said, not asking but observing. Jacob shook his head slowly. "Nothing about this is sustainable, but tomorrow is tomorrow's problem. Today we eat, today we're together, today he's alive and so am I." There was a philosophy in those words that Ethan found both heartbreaking and oddly inspiring. Living moment to moment not by choice but by necessity, finding grace in small victories like a successful day of not being separated or discovered. The rain was starting to let up, but the temperature was dropping. Ethan could see his breath now, small puffs of white in the lamplight. Milo curled into a tighter ball, and Jacob adjusted the tarp to cover him better. The tenderness of the gesture, the automatic care, told Ethan everything he needed to know about the relationship between these two unlikely companions. This wasn't about money or exploitation. This was about survival and love, though Jacob would probably never use that word. "What would you do?" Ethan asked slowly. "If you could do anything? If papers weren't a problem, if money wasn't a problem, what would you do?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Ethan thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion, barely held in check. "There's a sanctuary," he said. 200 miles north. Real land, real forests. They take orphaned bears, rehabilitate them when possible, give them a home when it's not. The woman who runs it, she knew my work from before. She would take Milo, I know she would, but I can't get him there. No car, no way to transport a bear on public transportation, and walking would take weeks through areas where we'd surely be spotted. "And you?" Ethan asked. "What would happen to you?" Jacob's smile was sad but genuine. I would know he was safe. That would be enough. But Ethan could see the lie in that statement, could see how much it would cost Jacob to give up the one thing that had kept him going. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The square was almost empty now, just a few late-night stragglers hurrying home. The city sound seemed muffled by the recent rain, creating a strange sense of isolation, as if they were the only three living beings in the world. Ethan found himself thinking about choices and chances, about the random intersections that change lives. If he hadn't left his meeting early, if he hadn't decided to walk instead of taking a taxi, if the rain hadn't driven him to seek shelter under the same awning where he could see Jacob and Milo, none of this would be happening. He would be in his hotel room now, probably answering emails or watching something mindless on television, completely unaware that somewhere in the same city, a man and a bear cub were facing another cold night with only each other for warmth and comfort. "I want to help," Ethan heard himself say, the words coming out before he had fully formed the thought. Jacob looked at him sharply, suspicion and hope warring in his expression. "People always say that," he said carefully. "Then they realize how complicated it is and they disappear. I don't blame them. It's not their problem, but I've learned not to count on words anymore." The rejection stung. But Ethan understood it. How many well-meaning people had probably made promises they couldn't keep? How many times had Jacob allowed himself to hope only to be disappointed? "I'm not just saying it," Ethan insisted, though he still had no idea what help would look like. "I have resources, connections. There has to be a way." Even as he said it, he was thinking through possibilities. He knew lawyers who dealt with immigration issues. He had a cousin who worked with wildlife conservation. Surely, between all his contacts, someone would know how to navigate this situation. Jacob studied him for a long moment, then said something that surprised Ethan. "Why? Why do you care? You don't know us. You could walk away right now and forget this ever happened." It was a fair question, and Ethan struggled to find an answer that would make sense. Why did he care? Was it the unexpected humanity he had found in what he thought would be a simple case of animal abuse? Was it the quiet dignity of Jacob refusing to give up despite having every reason to? Was it Milo himself, this small wild creature caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither? Or was it something in Ethan that had been sleeping until this moment, some part of him that had been waiting for a chance to do something that actually mattered? "I don't know," Ethan admitted finally, "but I do care, and that has to count for something." Jacob nodded slowly, as if this answer, in its honesty, was better than any grand declaration would have been. "Okay," he said simply. "Okay." It wasn't acceptance exactly, more like a willingness to see what would happen next. Milo chose that moment to wake up properly, lifting his head and looking around with those dark, intelligent eyes. His gaze fixed on Ethan, and they stared at each other for a long moment. Ethan had never been this close to a bear before, even a small one. He could see the individual hairs of Milo's fur, the way his ears twitched at sounds Ethan couldn't hear, the rise and fall of his small chest as he breathed. Then Milo did something unexpected. He stretched out one paw toward Ethan, not aggressively, but with what seemed like curiosity. Ethan looked at Jacob, who nodded permission, and slowly extended his own hand. When Milo's paw touched his palm, Ethan felt something electric pass between them. Not literally, but something just as real. The paw was softer than he expected, padded and warm despite the cold night. Milo made a small sound, almost like a purr, but different, uniquely bear-like. Then he withdrew his paw and curled back up, apparently satisfied with whatever he had learned from the interaction. "He doesn't usually do that," Jacob said, and there was something different in his voice now, a slight softening of the defensive walls he had built. "He's very careful with strangers. Has to be." Ethan felt oddly honored by the small gesture of trust from the cub. It seemed to signify something, though he wasn't sure what. A beginning, perhaps. A possibility. "Tell me about the sanctuary," Ethan said. "The one up north. Tell me everything you know about it." Jacob's eyes lit up slightly, the first real sign of animation Ethan had seen from him. "It's called Haven Woods, run by a woman named Sarah Chen. She used to work for the Forestry Service, like me, but in a different country. Started the sanctuary 15 years ago with her own money after seeing too many orphaned animals with nowhere to go. She has permits, legal standing, everything proper. Takes in bears, wolves, foxes, anything that needs help. Some get released back to the wild. Others stay if they can't survive on their own." The way Jacob spoke about the place, it was clear he had researched it thoroughly. Probably dreaming of it as the solution to their problem while knowing it was impossibly out of reach. "She has staff now," Jacob continued. "Volunteers, too. Veterinarians who donate their time. It's a real operation, not just some backyard setup. Milo would have space to roam, other bears to learn from when he's older. He could be a bear there, not this." He gestured at their current situation, the wet street, the tin cup, the impossibility of it all. "Have you spoken to her?" Ethan asked. "This Sarah Chen?" Jacob nodded. "Once, on a borrowed phone. She remembered me from a conference years ago. Said she would take Milo immediately if I could get him there. Even offered to help with transportation costs, but..." He shrugged. "It's not about money, it's about legality. Transporting a bear across state lines without proper documentation is a federal crime. And I don't have the right to be in this country, let alone transport wildlife. One traffic stop, and it would all be over. Milo would be confiscated and probably euthanized, and I would be deported." The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer to Ethan. This wasn't just about finding a home for a bear cub. It was about navigating legal systems, bureaucracy, the intersection of immigration law and wildlife protection. It was the kind of problem that money alone couldn't solve, though money might help. "What if," Ethan said slowly, thinking out loud, "what if we could make it legal? Get the right paperwork, the right permissions. There must be provisions for situations like this. Emergency placement of orphaned wildlife or something." "Maybe," Jacob said, but his tone suggested he had already been down this road. "But that requires lawyers, time, someone the system recognizes as legitimate to sponsor the application. It requires being visible to authorities who might decide to solve the problem the easy way, by taking Milo and removing me from the equation." The fear in his voice was controlled but real. Ethan began to understand that for Jacob, losing Milo wouldn't just mean losing a bear. It would mean losing his purpose, his reason for continuing in a world that had already taken everything else from him. They sat quietly again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of strangers, but of conspirators, trying to solve a puzzle together. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets shining under the lamps. The air smelled clean and cold, with a hint of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. Milo slept on, occasionally making small sounds in his dreams, little huffs and sighs that made him seem impossibly young and vulnerable. "I need to make some calls," Ethan said finally. "I have a friend who works in environmental law. Another who has connections with wildlife organizations. Maybe between them we can find a way." He pulled out his phone, then hesitated. "But first, you both need somewhere warm to sleep tonight, somewhere safe." Jacob stiffened. "We don't need charity," he said, pride making his voice sharp. "We've managed this long." But even as he said it, Ethan could see him shivering, could see how thin Milo looked despite his fur coat. "It's not charity," Ethan said carefully. "It's practicality. If we're going to solve this, I need you both healthy and safe. I need to know where to find you. And honestly," he added, deciding truth was better than careful words, "I need to know you'll still be here in the morning, that you won't disappear because trusting someone seems too dangerous." Jacob looked at him for a long moment, then at Milo, then back at Ethan. The internal struggle was visible on his face, the battle between pride and practicality, between independence and the welfare of the cub he had sworn to protect. "One night," Jacob said finally. "We'll accept help for one night, but if your calls don't lead anywhere, if this is just another dead end, we go back to managing on our own. Deal?" Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. It was a start. Just a start, but sometimes that's all you need. "There's a motel about 6 blocks from here," Ethan said. "Pet-friendly. I'll tell them Milo is a dog. In the dark, with him wrapped in a blanket, no one will look too closely." It was a risk, but everything about this situation was a risk. Jacob stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on cold stone. He bent to gather their few possessions, the tin cup, a small bag that probably contained all their worldly goods, the tarp. Then, with infinite gentleness, he picked up Milo. The cub stirred but didn't wake, just nestled closer to Jacob's chest. In that moment, Ethan saw them not as a homeless man and a bear, but as a father and child, bound by something stronger than blood or species. They walked through the quiet streets together, an unlikely trio moving through shadows and lamplight. Ethan found himself constantly checking their surroundings, newly aware of how visible they were, how vulnerable. Every passing car made him tense. Every distant siren made his heart race. He was getting just a small taste of what Jacob must feel every moment of every day. The constant vigilance, the fear of discovery, the weight of protecting something that the world said shouldn't exist. The motel clerk barely looked up when Ethan paid for the room in cash, too absorbed in whatever was playing on the small television behind the desk. The room was basic but clean, with 2 beds and a radiator that clanked but produced blessed heat. As soon as they were inside with the door locked, Jacob set Milo down on one of the beds. The cub woke up, looked around with interest at the new surroundings, then promptly began exploring every corner of the room with the curiosity that must be hardwired into every young creature. "He seems happy," Ethan observed, watching Milo investigate the bathroom with particular fascination. Jacob actually smiled, a real smile that took years off his weathered face. He's never been in a room like this. Look at him. He thinks it's a cave, maybe, somewhere safe and warm. The simple joy in Jacob's voice at seeing Milo comfortable and exploring made Ethan's chest tight. How long had it been since these two had felt truly safe, even for a moment? While Jacob got Milo settled, Ethan stepped outside to make his calls. The first was to his friend Marcus, the environmental lawyer. It was late, but Marcus answered on the 3rd ring, his voice sharp with concern. "Ethan? Everything okay?" Ethan took a breath and began to explain, trying to make the situation sound as reasonable as possible. There was a long silence when he finished. "You want me to help you legally transport an illegally kept bear cub across state lines for an undocumented immigrant," Marcus summarized. When put like that, it sounded insane. "Yes," Ethan said simply. "That's exactly what I need you to do." Another silence. Then Marcus sighed. Let me make some calls. There might be something under wildlife rescue provisions, especially if we can get the sanctuary to file the paperwork from their end. But Ethan, this is complicated, really complicated. Ethan knew that, but hearing it from Marcus made it real in a different way. Just see what you can do, he said. Please. His next call was to his cousin Lisa, who worked with a conservation group. She was more immediately sympathetic, having dealt with similar situations before. "Oh, those poor souls," she said when Ethan finished explaining. "Both of them. Let me reach out to my contacts. There's an underground network of people who help with situations like this. Not illegal, just creative about working within the system. Give me until morning." When Ethan went back into the room, he found a scene that stopped him in his tracks. Jacob was sitting on the floor, leaning against one of the beds, and Milo was curled up against him, both of them watching the television with identical expressions of wonder. It was playing some nature documentary, and Milo's ears perked forward every time another bear appeared on screen. "He recognizes them," Jacob said softly. "Knows they're like him, even though he's never seen another bear except his mother." The poignancy of that statement, this orphaned cub recognizing his own kind through a television screen, was almost too much. Ethan sat down on the other bed, suddenly exhausted by the emotional weight of the evening. "My friends are working on it," he said. "We should know something by morning." Jacob nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Milo, who was now trying to touch the television screen where a bear cub was playing in a river. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said after a moment. "Why did you trust me? Even a little? You don't know anything about me." Jacob was quiet for so long Ethan thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, "You crouched down. When you first approached us, you didn't stand over us. You came down to our level. Most people who want to help, they stand above you and reach down. But you sat with us in the rain. That told me something about who you are." It was such a simple thing, but Ethan understood. Respect came in small gestures, in the choice to meet someone where they were, rather than expecting them to rise to where you stood. "Besides," Jacob added with a slight smile, "Milo liked you. He's a better judge of character than I am. Animals always are. They see what's real, not what we pretend to be." As if understanding he was being discussed, Milo abandoned the television and padded over to Ethan. He stood on his hind legs, front paws on the bed, and looked at Ethan with those impossibly deep eyes. Then he made a sound that was almost like a question, a soft, interrogative grunt that seemed to ask who this new person was and why he was part of their small pack now. Ethan carefully extended his hand, and Milo sniffed it thoroughly before giving it a small lick. His tongue was rougher than a dog's, but gentler than Ethan expected. "He's saying thank you," Jacob translated, though Ethan suspected he was projecting human emotions onto the bear. Still, it felt true enough. There was gratitude in this room, for warmth, for safety, for the possibility of hope, however slim. They ordered food from a nearby restaurant that delivered, and Ethan watched in fascination as Jacob carefully prepared Milo's portion, mixing some of the meat with vegetables in a way that suggested long practice and careful study of what a growing bear needed. "I researched everything," Jacob explained, seeing Ethan's interest. "Library computers when I could access them, what bears eat in the wild at different ages, what nutrients they need. I've probably read more about bear nutrition than most zookeepers." The dedication was impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure. All that knowledge and care applied in impossible circumstances just to keep one small bear alive and healthy. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself telling Jacob about his own life. His job in consulting, his comfortable but somehow empty existence, the way he had been sleepwalking through his days until tonight. "I make good money," he said. "I have a nice apartment, a car, savings. But watching you with Milo, seeing how much every moment matters to you both, I realize I haven't really been living. Just existing." Jacob listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if he understood that particular kind of emptiness. "Purpose," Jacob said finally. "That's what Milo gave me when I had lost everything else. Purpose is what makes us get up in the morning, what makes us keep going when everything says we should stop. You have comfort, but comfort isn't purpose." It was a profound observation from someone who had every reason to be bitter about the comfortable lives of others. But there was no resentment in Jacob's voice, just a statement of truth as he saw it. Milo had fallen asleep again, this time sprawled across the entire second bed in a position that looked impossibly uncomfortable, but apparently suited him perfectly. His paws twitched occasionally. Chasing dream prey, or perhaps playing with other cubs in the forests of his imagination. "What will you do?" Ethan asked quietly. "If we can get him to the sanctuary, what will you do then?" The question had been nagging at him all evening. Saving Milo was only half the equation. Jacob stared at the sleeping cub for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "For 3 months, every thought has been about keeping him safe, keeping him fed, keeping us together. I haven't let myself think beyond that." The honesty was painful. Here was a man who had given everything to save one small life, with no plan for his own future beyond that single purpose. "You could stay near the sanctuary," Ethan suggested. "Find work in the area, visit him." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't that simple. Without documentation, Jacob couldn't legally work. Without money, he couldn't stay anywhere. "Maybe," Jacob said, but his tone suggested he had already accepted that saving Milo would likely mean losing him forever. The sacrifice was written in every line of his face. Accepted, but not without enormous cost. They talked through the night, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. Ethan learned about Jacob's life before, the mountains he had protected, the animals he had saved, the family he had lost touch with when work became his whole world, and then work disappeared. Jacob learned about Ethan's world of board meetings and spreadsheets, of success measured in numbers that suddenly seemed meaningless when compared to the simple victory of keeping one small bear alive another day. As dawn began to creep through the curtains, Ethan's phone rang. It was Lisa, his cousin, and her voice was excited. "I found something," she said. "There's a provision for emergency wildlife rehabilitation transport. If the sanctuary files as the receiving facility and a veterinarian certifies that the animal needs immediate relocation for health reasons, we can get temporary permits. It's not usually used for this kind of situation, but my contact says it could work." Ethan felt his heart leap. "What about Jacob?" he asked. "Can he travel with Milo?" "As a temporary caretaker, yes," Lisa said. "The bear is habituated to him. Separating them for transport could cause trauma that would impede rehabilitation. It's a stretch, but we have a sympathetic vet who's willing to make that argument. It wasn't a complete solution. It didn't solve Jacob's immigration status or his long-term situation, but it was a start. It was hope." Ethan looked at Jacob, who was watching him with carefully controlled expression, afraid to hope but unable not to. "We might have a way," Ethan said, and watched as Jacob's composure finally cracked, tears sliding silently down his weathered cheeks. He didn't sob or break down, just let the tears fall while his hand found Milo's sleeping form, fingers burying themselves in the warm fur as if to reassure himself that this was real. They were still together, and maybe, just maybe, they would find their way to safety. The next hours were a blur of phone calls and arrangements. Marcus worked on the legal framework while Lisa coordinated with the sanctuary and the veterinarian. Ethan found himself in the unexpected position of logistics coordinator, arranging for a vehicle that could safely transport a bear cub, figuring out the route that would avoid major checkpoints, ensuring they had all the documentation they might need. It was like putting together a business deal, except the stakes were so much higher than any profit margin. Sarah Chen from the sanctuary turned out to be a force of nature even over the phone. "I've been hoping someone would help them," she said, when Ethan finally spoke to her directly. "Jacob called me weeks ago, and I've been trying to figure out a solution ever since. You're an angel for making this happen." Ethan didn't feel like an angel. He felt like someone who had stumbled into something important and was trying not to mess it up. But Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious. "We have a perfect space for Milo," she continued. "Other cubs his age he can socialize with, and honestly, we could use someone with Jacob's experience. I can't officially offer him a job, but we have volunteer positions that come with housing. It's not much, but it's a start." The piece about Jacob was unexpected and wonderful. Ethan hadn't dared hope for that much. When he told Jacob, the man actually smiled, a real, full smile that transformed his entire face. "I could stay near him?" Jacob asked, as if afraid he had misunderstood. "I could still see him, help take care of him?" Ethan nodded, and Jacob had to turn away, overcome by emotion. Even Milo seemed to sense the change in atmosphere, waking up and padding over to Jacob, pushing his head against the man's leg in what looked like comfort. By afternoon, everything was in place. The permits were temporary and somewhat dubious, but they would hold up to casual scrutiny. The veterinarian had examined Milo and written a report emphasizing the urgent need for proper facilities that only a sanctuary could provide. A van had been rented, equipped with a proper transport cage, though Ethan suspected Milo would spend most of the journey outside it, curled up with Jacob. The route was planned. The sanctuary was expecting them, and everything that could be arranged had been arranged. Standing in the motel parking lot, watching Jacob carefully load their few possessions into the van, Ethan felt a strange sense of completion and beginning all at once. In less than 24 hours, his life had taken a turn he never could have expected. He had used his resources and connections not for profit or advancement, but for something that actually mattered. And in doing so, he had discovered something about himself that had been buried under years of comfortable routine. "You're coming with us, right?" Jacob asked. And Ethan realized he had been so focused on making arrangements he hadn't thought about his own role once everything was in motion. "To the sanctuary, I mean. To see us settled?" There was vulnerability in the question, a need for the presence of the one person who had believed in them when no one else would. Ethan looked at his phone, at the messages from work asking where he was, at the life waiting for him to return to it. Then he looked at Jacob and Milo, at this unlikely pair who had shown him what it meant to truly care for something beyond yourself. "Yes," he said, surprising himself with how easy the decision was. "I'm coming with you." He sent a quick message to his office saying he was dealing with a family emergency and would be out for a few days. It wasn't entirely a lie. In some strange way, these two had become family in the space of a single night. The kind of family you choose, the kind that changes you. The drive north was surreal. Milo, after initial nervousness about the van, settled into the journey with remarkable calm. He spent most of the time with his head on Jacob's lap, occasionally lifting it to look out the window at the passing landscape. As they left the city behind and trees began to dominate the view, both bear and man seemed to relax, as if returning to their natural element. They stopped only twice, once for food and fuel, once to let Milo stretch his legs in a secluded rest area where no other travelers were around. Watching the cub explore the grass and trees, even for just a few minutes, Ethan understood viscerally why this journey was so important. Milo belonged in nature, not on city streets. This was his birthright being restored. Jacob was quiet for most of the journey, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the tense silence of the night before. Occasionally, he would point out something to Milo, a hawk circling overhead, a river glimpsed through trees, and the cub would respond with interest, as if filing away information about the world he was entering. "He's learning," Jacob explained when Ethan commented on it. "Even though he was raised by me, the instincts are all there. He knows this is where he belongs." As they got closer to the sanctuary, Ethan found himself getting nervous. What if something went wrong? What if the permits weren't enough? What if someone decided to enforce rules that would tear apart everything they had built? But Jacob seemed calm, almost serene. "Whatever happens," he said, seeming to sense Ethan's anxiety, "you've given us this journey, this hope. Even if it doesn't work out, we had this." It was a kind of acceptance Ethan wasn't sure he could have managed in Jacob's position. But their arrival at Haven Woods was nothing like Ethan's fears. Sarah Chen was waiting for them at the entrance, a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. She took one look at Milo, who was peering curiously out of the van, and her face lit up. "Oh, look at you, beautiful boy," she said softly. And Milo, as if recognizing a kindred spirit, made a small, welcoming sound. The tour of the facilities was a revelation. This wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a carefully designed habitat that gave rescued animals as natural a life as possible while ensuring their safety. There were multiple enclosures for different species and situations, medical facilities, quarantine areas for new arrivals, and best of all, a large forested area where rehabilitated animals could learn or relearn wild behaviors. "Milo will start in quarantine," Sarah explained. "Standard procedure for all new arrivals. But Jacob can stay with him during that time. After that, we'll introduce him gradually to our other young bears. He needs to learn how to be a bear from other bears, but having Jacob nearby will make the transition easier." The quarantine area was more like a comfortable cabin than a cage, with indoor and outdoor sections, climbing structures, a pool for swimming, and plenty of enrichment toys. Milo explored it all with obvious delight, and for the first time since Ethan had met them, the cub acted like what he was, a young animal full of energy and curiosity. Jacob watched with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. "He's happy," he said simply. "Look at him, he's happy." Sarah showed Jacob the volunteer quarters, a small but clean apartment attached to the main facility. "It's yours for as long as you want it," she said. "Officially, you're a volunteer. Unofficially, you're exactly what we need. Someone with real experience who understands these animals. We'll work on the paperwork situation. I have lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing. It might take time, but we'll figure it out." The relief on Jacob's face was profound. Not just survival, but a future, a purpose, a way to stay connected to Milo while the cub grew into what he was meant to be. As the sun set on that first day at the sanctuary, Ethan stood with Jacob watching Milo play in his new pool, splashing with abandon in a way he never could have in the city. "I don't know how to thank you," Jacob said quietly. "You saved us both." But Ethan shook his head. "You saved each other," he said. "I just helped you get where you needed to be, and honestly, you saved me too, from a life that looked successful but felt empty. You showed me what it means to truly commit to something, to love something enough to sacrifice everything for it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Milo discover what it meant to be a bear in a place where being a bear was not just allowed, but celebrated. Other bears could be heard in the distance, and Milo's ears perked at the sounds, instinctively understanding that there were others like him nearby. Soon he would meet them, learn from them, become part of a community he had never known existed. But for now, he was content to play in his pool, occasionally looking over at Jacob as if to make sure he was still there, still watching, still caring. "Will you visit?" Jacob asked suddenly. "I mean, I know you have your life to get back to, but..." Ethan thought about his life, about the comfortable routine waiting for him, about the meetings and reports and predictable days. Then he thought about this place, about Jacob and Milo, about the sense of purpose he had felt in the last day that exceeded anything he had felt in years. "I'll visit," he said. "Often, and I'm going to see about setting up a foundation to help with situations like yours. There must be others out there, people and animals caught in impossible situations who just need someone to help them navigate the system." Jacob looked at him with surprise and something that might have been pride. "That would be something," he said. "That would really be something." As darkness fell and the sanctuary settled into its nighttime routine, Ethan realized that his simple evening walk in the rain had led him to this moment, this place, these individuals who had changed his understanding of what mattered in life. He had thought he was saving them, but in truth, they had saved him from a life of comfortable meaninglessness. The next morning, Ethan had to leave. His real life, as he had thought of it, was calling him back. But as he said goodbye to Jacob and Milo, he knew he would return. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Milo seemed to understand that Ethan was leaving, and he did something remarkable. He stood on his hind legs and placed his paws on Ethan's shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. It was a gesture so human-like, yet so essentially bear that it took Ethan's breath away. Then the cub dropped back to all fours and ambled back to his pool, as if to say that everything was as it should be. "Thank you," Jacob said simply, shaking Ethan's hand with both of his. "Thank you for seeing us. Really seeing us." As Ethan drove away from the sanctuary, he thought about that word, seeing. How often do we really see the stories unfolding around us? How often do we walk past someone assuming we know their situation, their struggles, their worth? He had almost done that with Jacob and Milo, almost walked past what looked like a simple case of exploitation without seeing the love, sacrifice, and impossible choices underneath. 6 months later, Ethan returned to the sanctuary as he had many times since that first visit. The transformation was remarkable. Milo had grown significantly, his coat glossy and thick, his movements confident and bear-like in a way they hadn't been on the city streets. He was playing with 2 other young bears, wrestling and tumbling in a way that spoke of pure joy. When he saw Ethan, he paused and looked over. And Ethan could swear there was recognition in those dark eyes. But then, one of the other cubs pounced on him, and Milo was back in the game, being what he was always meant to be, a bear among bears. Jacob had transformed too, still weathered, still carrying the marks of hard years, but standing taller, smiling more. He had become invaluable to the sanctuary, his experience and intuition with animals making him a natural caretaker. The immigration lawyers Sarah had connected him with were making progress on his case, and there was real hope for a permanent solution. "He doesn't need me as much anymore," Jacob said, watching Milo play. There was sadness in his voice, but pride too. That's how it should be. That's success, when they don't need you anymore. But Ethan could see that Milo still looked for Jacob, still came to the fence when he appeared, still remembered the man who had saved him. The bond was different now. Not the desperate dependence of survival, but something deeper and more chosen. Love, Ethan thought, came in many forms, and this was one of the purest he had ever witnessed. The foundation Ethan had started was small, but growing. They had already helped relocate 3 other orphaned animals and their human caretakers to appropriate facilities. Each case was complex. Each required creative solutions. But each reminded Ethan of that night in the rain when he had chosen to really see, instead of just look. Standing there in the afternoon sun, watching Milo play with his own kind while Jacob looked on with paternal pride, Ethan thought about the strange paths life takes. A chance encounter on a rainy night had led to this, to saved lives, to purpose found, to understanding that heroism often comes not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of recognizing suffering and choosing to help. The story could have ended so differently. Jacob and Milo could have remained on the streets until tragedy inevitably struck. Ethan could have walked past, could have chosen the easier path of non-involvement. But they had all chosen differently, and those choices had created this moment. A bear learning to be wild, a man finding new purpose, and Ethan himself understanding finally what it meant to truly make a difference. As the sun began to set, painting the sanctuary in golden light, Milo left his playmates and ambled over to where Jacob stood. The bear was almost too big now for Jacob to pick up, but he still pressed against the man's legs, still sought that familiar comfort. Jacob's hand found its way to Milo's head, fingers running through the thick fur in a gesture that had comforted them both through so many difficult nights. And Ethan understood that this was what love looked like. Not possession, but the willingness to let go. Not control, but the courage to help something become what it was meant to be. The sanctuary had given Milo a future as a bear. It had given Jacob a purpose and a home. And it had given Ethan something he hadn't even known he was missing, the knowledge that one person really could make a difference, that compassion and action could change lives, that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do was simply refuse to walk away from someone else's pain. As he prepared to leave, to return to his transformed life where profit had taken a back seat to purpose, Ethan took one last look at the scene. Milo was heading back to play with the other cubs, his gait confident and bear-like. Jacob was smiling, really smiling as he watched. And in that moment, everything that had led to this, the rain, the chance encounter, the difficult decisions, the leap of faith, all of it seemed not like random chance but like destiny. Because sometimes, Ethan thought, the universe conspires to bring together those who need each other. A man who had lost everything, a bear who had lost his mother, and a person who had lost his way. They had found each other on a rain-soaked street corner, and in saving one another they had discovered what it truly meant to be alive. The story would continue, of course. Milo would grow, might eventually be released into protected wilderness if he developed the necessary skills. Jacob would continue his work at the sanctuary, helping other rescued animals find their way, and Ethan would keep building his foundation, creating bridges between the lost and the found, between need and help, between despair and hope. But that night, that first night when everything changed, would always be the heart of it. The moment when 3 souls recognized each other across the vast indifference of the world, and chose connection over isolation, love over fear, action over apathy. It was, Ethan thought as he drove away from the sanctuary one more time, the very definition of heroism. Not the loud, celebrated kind, but the quiet kind that happens when someone sees suffering and says, "Not on my watch, not if I can help." And in the end, that's all any of us can do. See clearly, act with compassion, and trust that small acts of love can indeed change the world, one rescued soul at a time. Milo's story had become legend at the sanctuary. told to new volunteers and visitors as an example of what was possible when people chose to care. But for Ethan, Jacob, and Milo himself, it was simpler than legend. It was just love, pure and complicated and transformative, the kind that crosses species and circumstances to remind us that we are all, in our own ways, just trying to find our way home.